Because of the likelihood of the overturn of Roe v. Wade and because of the Democratic push to codify abortion into law, I went ahead and scrapped this week's video and underwent my most ambitious project yet. I am here to present one omnibus video that debunks every single pro-choice argument. I'm Ryan Martin, this is Unsafe Media, and here I help you respond with wisdom and with virtue to the ideas that are shaping our culture and our very lives. Now, I have compiled 31 of the most common arguments that I've heard throughout my years debating this, but if you know of one or if you've recently heard of one that I don't cover in this video, please comment it down below. That also helps the algorithm, but I would love to make a part 2 answering more objections that I didn't get to in this one. Now, don't let the sheer volume and length of this video push you away. Look down below. Every single question is chaptered out. So you can just scrub ahead, jump to the question that you are interested in. I've categorized all of these major arguments into 3 major sections, and I tried to go from, in each of those sections, from the least sophisticated to the most sophisticated. Now, the first category is literally just titled utter nonsense. These are just slogans and cheap, dirty, quick, foolish attempts to support the pro-choice movement. Now, if you're a sophisticated thinker and you're on the pro-choice side, you may think that I'm cherry picking or that I'm nut picking, that I'm going after the easiest, the straw man. I'm not. I'm going to attempt to address the most difficult and sophisticated arguments for the pro-choice side later on in the video. It's just that since I'm trying to address every single one of them, here is just the portion of time where I'm going to actually address the lowest ones. Now, if you are a veteran of the pro-choice, pro-life debates, then you're familiar with, it's probably the toughest ones, which will be the IVF clinic and the personhood argument kind of forwarded by Steven Pinker, and the RBG, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, argument for equal rights. These will be addressed later on in the full-blown pro-choice section. Again, just check out the timestamps below if those are what you're looking for. Here is my only request, though. Before you scroll to all the other objections, I want you first to just watch the quick few minutes that I have on my pro-life position. I'm going to present a logical argument that's not appealing to scripture, it's not appealing to religion, it's just appealing to scientific facts, it's appealing to a basic, ubiquitous moral axiom, and then the logical connection between those 3. They will be recycled or referenced throughout the rest of the video, so please watch that short section first, then skip around to anything else you want. Here we go, the pro-life argument boiled down to just a couple of minutes. I was pro-life long before I was ever religious. I don't find the religious arguments for the pro-life position anywhere near as strong as the scientific and logical ones, and that's what I'll be presenting here. First, let's go ahead and lay out just a couple of scientific facts. First off, life has a beginning point. There is a point at which life begins, and we have to decide where that is. I had a person on my TikTok page recently say, well, it's useless to try to define that. And I had to ask them, what do you think biology is? Right? It's the study of life, and there's no way to study life unless you have some way of defining what life is. And as soon as you define what life is, then that immediately gives you a starting point. Anything that fits the categories or meets the qualifications for life is alive, and anything that does not fit those qualifications is not alive. It's pretty simple. It's not that complicated. So let me start with this simple fact. 95% of biologists, and I'm going to say right now for the skeptics who are like, well, he's not going to say this. I am. 85% of biologists are pro-choice. 85% of biologists are pro-choice. They support abortion, at least to a certain degree, okay? So they are not in any way ideologically biased towards what I'm about to tell you. 95% of them, pro-choice, pro-life, all included, 5,000 were surveyed, 95 agreed, came to the consensus that human life begins at fertilization. That's a scientific fact. If you read any book on embryology, they will say exactly that. Now, I'm not trying to appeal to authority. I'm actually going to explain what the qualifications for life are here in just a second. But I just want you, before you hear that part, I don't want you to hear it with an overly skeptical lens. I don't want you to go, oh, well, I can probably try to find some little way to refute that. The biologists, the pro-choice biologists, would disagree with you if you were to say that life did not begin at fertilization. That is the beginning point. We have to grapple with that. Then the question is, at what point do you get moral value, moral worth? Okay, so let's go ahead and cover, now that we've established that they believe that life begins at fertilization, why is that? Let's talk about the qualifications for life. So if you simply look up a textbook, which very few people will actually do, or you just Google it. I mean, you're literally on the internet right now. You can just pull up another tab and just look up the characteristics of life or qualifications for life. And don't look up one website. Look up 5, 6, 10, and you'll find slight derivations. But when you look up the definitions of the qualifications, what you will find is that they all basically agree on the same general qualifications. You'll find that they're made, for something to be alive, it has to be made up of cells. Every living thing that we know of is made of cells. Doesn't have to be. That's all we know of so far. It passes traits on to its offspring. That doesn't necessarily mean you reproduce, meaning have a kid. It just means that you have the potential to, that your cells, when your cells replicate, they pass on their traits. It has metabolism. It consumes. It uses energy. It absorbs energy and uses it. It grows and it changes over time. It responds to its environment. Okay. Now, every one of those characteristics is found in the earliest stages of development. The zygote, the human zygote, the first moment of fertilization, every single one of those characteristics is met. So the first scientific fact simply is this, is that human life begins at fertilization. You may be with the 85% of biologists who say, yes, that's true, but they don't have moral worth. Okay, well, we'll start there. But we have to at least admit scientifically there's no and if, ors, or buts about it. That's when your life began. The second scientific fact that we have to wrestle with, that we have to absorb and then fit into our moral framework, is the fact that abortion ends a human life, which I'll use the word for that as killing. Now, I'm going to do my absolute best to avoid the word murder. Murder is a moral term, and because of that, it carries with it certain connotations that include certain levels of guilt, certain levels of culpability, certain levels of in legal terms, they call it the mens rea, which is how guilty your mind is. So there's some level of intentionality, right? We separate out manslaughter versus negligent death versus murder. And so I want to take all those categories out of it. I want to just use the scientific term, okay? We're killing, meaning ending a life. Something's alive, it's no longer alive because of our action, we killed it. Fair enough. So life begins at fertilization and abortion kills human life. Now, I'm going to bring into the discussion a moral axiom, which I think is ubiquitous. It is, it's baked into the founding of this very nation. And I think that most people would have an intuitive agreement with it. You may have a different justification for why you agree with it, but most of us would agree with this moral axiom, okay? It is wrong to intentionally kill human beings without sufficient moral justification. So that leads us to our logical syllogism. Now, this is a deductive argument. Now, why is that important? In a deductive argument, if the logic is valid, and if the two premises are true, then the conclusion is inescapable. It doesn't matter how much you hate it. It doesn't matter how much you disagree with it. You are wrong if the logic is valid and the premises are true. So what I'm about to present here is this syllogism. In order to disagree with the conclusion, which if you're pro-choice, you will want to, what you're going to have to do is disprove either the first or the second premise. So here we go. Premise number 1, it is wrong to intentionally kill innocent human beings without morally justifying reasons. Number 2, abortions end an innocent human life, and almost none of them have sufficient justification. And number 3, therefore, almost all abortions are wrong. Now, why do I add in without sufficient moral justification? Because there are times when humans do kill innocents and it does seem to be justified. The famous trolley car example, right? The train is going down the tracks. It's going to hit 10 men. If you flip the switch, it'll go down. It'll hit one man, but it'll save 10, right? And so at least in that sort of situation, most people have the intuition that saving the 10 at the expense of the 1 seems to be justified. So what would be some situations in which abortion could be morally justified? Because I didn't say none of them are justified. I said that at least most of them are not. I think if a doctor could prove that without abortion, the mother would certainly die, then in that instance, there's at least some argument for abortion. Now, if you're Catholic, certainly if you're a Thomist, then you would actually go a different route. You would say it's not abortion. You would elect some sort of procedure that would save the mother's life, but may result by the law of double effect in the death of the child. I'm not sure if I want to go all the way towards that specific theory on morality. It may be that a safer way to actually protect the mother is through something like an abortion. I'm not certain there. But here's what I am certain of. The life of the mother is cited as the primary reason for only between 0.3, so it's a third of 1%, all the way up to 1% of all abortions. What that means is that between 99.7 and just 99% of all abortions have nothing to do with the life of the mother. A full 25% of women say the primary reason that they have an abortion is just because it doesn't seem like it's the right time for them. When they take these surveys, women normally give more than one answer. The most commonly cited answer among 75% of women is that it would interfere with things like school or their career or their family. Another 73 say things like it would impair them financially, which actually includes planning for college, which seems a lot like the first option. And almost 40% of women get abortions because they're done having kids. So the first premise, that it's always wrong to intentionally kill an innocent human being without sufficient justification, seems to me undeniable. The second, that abortion ends an innocent life, is scientifically undeniable. The second half of our second premise is that almost none are justified, I think is also undeniable given the stats I just cited. So therefore, almost all abortions are wrong. Now, from here going forward, as we jump into our pro-choice arguments, what you have to ask every time is, does it refute the first premise? Does it refute the second premise? Or does it show that my logic is invalid? Now, I think you'll find my logic is not flawed, meaning that the conclusion does follow from the two premises. Therefore, the only hope that these pro-choice arguments, the 31 that we're going through, the only hope they have of refuting the case I just put forward is that they would somehow disprove my first premise or my second premise. So with that being said, let's jump right in. The first category is the utter nonsense category. The first one up, the worst argument that you hear frequently is it's just a clump of cells. Now, what is this argument attempting to do? It's attempting to disprove my second premise that abortion ends an innocent human life. Now, instead of it being an argument that actually disproves my second premise, rather what it does is it provides a fact that supports my second premise. Remember that one of the qualifications for life is that it is made up of cells. So calling the baby a clump of cells is just to simply say it meets at least one of the qualifications for life. Now, I'm going to try to do this with as many of these arguments as I can. Let's steel man this, right? So instead of straw man, where you try to knock down a weaker version of an argument, I'm going to try to bolster this. I'm going to try to give it the best spin I can. To steel man the just a clump of cells argument, people typically will go something like, well, so is your appendix. You know, your appendix is just a clump of cells and it's alive. So therefore we can remove that. We can remove a fetus. But this is simply to confuse an organ with an organism. An organ is a group of tissues that form a specific structure that perform a certain task. An organism is a form of life. Your appendix is an organ. It's not a form of life, but the fetus is. Nonsense argument number 2. If you think that abortion is murder or is killing or something like that, then you also have to believe that seminal emissions and periods are miscarriages and abortions too. Again, please don't turn off the video assuming that I'm strawmanning these people. I promise you, I've heard this argument. Feel free to skip ahead. Go to a better argument. But I'm not the one presenting these arguments. They're presented to me. I'm just going to knock them down. This confuses gametes with organisms. Gametes are organisms' reproductive cells. They are haploid cells containing only one set of chromosomes. Human somatic cells, which are just simply the non-sex cells of the human organism, they are, as well as most mammals, are diploid cells, meaning they contain two sets of chromosomes, not just one. Only our sex cells contain that. I don't think there's a way to steelman this one, so I think we'll just go ahead and move on to our third. Miscarriages, and this is presented by Bill Nye. In fact, I'll let you hear from him. He suggests that if you think that abortion is killing, then that means that miscarriages would result in somebody being punishable. Check it out.
Eggs get fertilized, and by that I mean sperm get accepted by ova a lot. But that's not all you need. You have to attach to the uterine wall, the inside of a womb, a woman's womb. But if you're going to hold that as a standard, that is to say, if you're going to say And when an egg is fertilized, it's therefore has the same rights as an individual. Then whom are you going to sue? Whom are you going to imprison? Every woman who's had a fertilized egg pass through her? Every guy whose sperm has fertilized an egg and then it didn't become a human? Have all these people failed you?
So I hope that served as a friendly reminder that Bill Nye should not be respected by literally anybody as an authority on literally anything. Here he is confusing accidental or natural death with intentional killing. I'm going to go ahead and just show you, I think the third top comment, I think he expresses the sentiment best. Who are you going to imprison? Every woman who had a fertilized egg pass through her? Great point, Bill. We should decriminalize murder because sometimes people die on accident. How could we possibly consistently punish intentional homicide when people die by accident all the time? Bill Nye's a fool. Moving on. The old Clinton slogan, you'll see them say here, safe, legal, and rare.
We can support a woman's right to choose that makes abortion safe, legal, and rare, and reduces the number of abortions.
As everyone has pointed out, this is a self-contradiction. If it's true, then it is false. What do I mean? If it should be rare, that implies there's something wrong with it. But what is that wrong thing? That leads us back to my argument that it is the intentional killing of the innocent. But if that's true, then it shouldn't be legal. This is silliness. Thankfully, most people have moved on from it. So we'll move on to our next argument. I hear this presented frequently. It's not like somebody just flippantly has an abortion. It's always a hard decision for the woman. And my question is, what is this supposed to prove? What is try to form that into a syllogism. That syllogism might go something like, if a decision is really hard for somebody, then even morally impermissible choices become okay. Premise 2, abortion is one of those hard decisions. Premise 3, therefore it's okay. This is as well self-refuting like the safe, legal, and rare. If it's a hard decision, why? Why is it a hard decision? It's usually not a hard decision for people to use contraception. It's not a giant moral quandary for most people. In fact, most people who get abortions don't feel that same moral quandary about contraception. So why do they feel a moral difficulty with this one? It's because, as the feeling implies, there's something wrong about this. What is that wrong thing? It's that it's a living human being. Next one, if you are pro-life, then you can't be for the death penalty. Hopefully, when you hear that one, your eyes roll in the back of your head and you pass out from the stupidity. You know that there's a category error here. The goal is simply to show that there's an inconsistency in the pro-life ethic. Now, this wouldn't prove that it's okay to kill innocent people. It wouldn't prove that abortion does not kill an innocent human being. So it's only hoping to prove that there's an inconsistency in somebody who themselves is pro-life. So this would be an ad hominem fallacy, attacking the person instead of their argument. But if you go back to that fundamental moral axiom, I said it's always wrong to kill an innocent person without justification. Okay. Now, in the case of, say, the death penalty, they're not innocent and it's not without justification. And so it's perfectly fine for us to execute them underneath the authority of the state. Going back to the well for everybody's absolute favorite response, reproductive rights, or it's her choice, who are you to say? I honestly have never been able to make heads or tails of what reproductive rights actually were supposed to be. So I went ahead and looked up. Just give me a definition. Here's what it says. Reproductive rights is the ability to choose whether and when to have children. In recent years, policies affecting women's reproductive rights in the United States have substantially changed at both the federal and state levels. If anything, this might sort of attempt to refute the second premise that the baby isn't alive. But of course, again, scientifically, that's nonsense. At the time you are pregnant, reproduction, biologically speaking, this is not a talking point. This is just a scientific fact. If you're pregnant, reproduction has occurred. You have a child, and it is your responsibility to take care of that child. You had the right to choose when to have a child, but you now have one. Once you have a child, you can no longer choose to abandon them or to kill them or to do some other nefarious thing with them. It is now your responsibility to take care of them or see to it that someone else does. Now, let's go ahead and let's steel man this argument. This argument would work for those who are maybe being prohibited from accessing contraception. If the pro-life movement moves into sort of the more Catholic wing at some point in the future, and the Catholic wing really takes over and they're very anti-contraception, this argument could work against that, because that would actually prevent reproduction. But it wouldn't work once reproduction has occurred. Next, you see this in all the like quasi-medical websites. They'll refer to abortion as the removal of a pregnancy. The problem is that pregnancy is not something that you remove. Pregnancy is a condition of having a developing embryo or fetus in the body. It is a state of being pregnant. It's the state of being. You can't remove a state of being. You can remove an object that state of being refers to. So you could remove the embryo, you can remove the fetus, but you can't remove the state of being. Now, once you've removed the fetus, then you have ended the state of being pregnant. This is just a really desperate attempt to avoid having to say what abortion is, which is the removing of an innocent human from the place where he will develop or she will develop. That means that it is the intentional killing of an innocent human. I know this one may seem obscure, but I had it presented directly to me by a family friend. They said, I explained what abortion was and how the procedure went. And they said, but what if it wasn't so grotesque? What if it didn't involve, cutting up or starving them to death? The answer is simply this: killing is killing. It doesn't matter how pleasant it is. You can't get off of death row just by saying, but I stroked her hair as she died, right? Being nice to your victim doesn't make you less of a predator. I hear this one frequently on social media. Why do you even care? It doesn't actually affect you. Let's go back to our syllogism. It's a morally innocent person, and their life is being ended, scientifically speaking. Therefore, I'll introduce actually a new axiom here. If there is a system of governance that dehumanizes a classification of human, and it results in millions of them being killed, then moral humans should care about it and oppose it. Logically, it follows then that human beings who seek to be moral and wise and virtuous, they should care deeply about abortion, and they should seek to end it. Next, very similarly, if you don't like an abortion, don't get an abortion. I don't think I actually have to refute this. I just have to restate it in its clear, unambiguous terminology. Abortion kills an innocent human. So if you don't like innocent human beings being killed, then don't do it. You wouldn't say that about any other form of killing. You're being inconsistent. This is evil. Next, and I've seen some really gullible kind of quasi-conservatives fall for this one. I'm against abortion once they're pain capable. Now, there is an incrementalist anti-abortion movement that has used pain capability to tug at your heartstrings to get you to say, okay, yeah, I guess I'm against killing humans that can feel it. But that's logically and morally unacceptable. Your inalienable rights don't come from your ability to feel pain. There are those who are born without the ability to feel pain. They have congenital insensitivity to pain. We have anesthesia. And yet, in all of those instances, if somebody can't feel pain, that does not justify killing them. So again, both of the premises stand, and so does the conclusion. All right, those were the worst of the worst. Now we're moving into something a little more substantive. These are the anti-pro-life arguments. Now, each of these arguments will not actually justify abortion. They're simply aimed at tearing down those who support the pro-life movement. First, let's tackle probably the most popular one at the moment. It's blazing, it's everywhere. It's that you're not pro-life, you're just pro-birth. Notice that does not change the moral axiom at the beginning of the syllogism. It doesn't change the science, and therefore it doesn't change the conclusion. This again is what we call an ad hominem fallacy. They're attacking the proponent of the argument instead of the substance of the argument. Therefore, it's fallacious. We can just ignore it. But you know what? You didn't come to this channel just to ignore arguments. We're going to go and accept their premise and see if they're right. Are pro-life people actually just pro-birth? The pro-life movement is made up almost entirely of Republicans and religious people. So let's go ahead and let's look at their activities. Let's look at their giving, at their adoption rates, and let's see, are they actually just pro-birth, or are they, as I'm going to prove, actually pro-life in a holistic sense? According to multiple studies, including the one you see now, Republicans give more than their Democrat counterparts. that does not take into account how effective that money is used. It does not. This is not an argument for private charity over government spending, but it is simply to say that Republicans give more to personal private charities than do their Democrat counterparts. They're obviously not simply pro-birth. One thing you'll hear whenever that statistic is brought up is they'll say, "Oh, that's just them giving to church." All right, but it turns out that Republicans and religious people are more likely not only to give to religious organizations like church and religious charities, but they're actually more likely than secular people to give to secular foundations. What about the topic at hand? What are we going to do with all these kids once they get born when we ban abortion? Well, it turns out that practicing Christians are 150% more likely to adopt than their secular counterparts. And they're 50% more likely to be foster parents. You hear frequently that this argument against straight white Christian yada yada yada.
Notice, I mean, I'm not the first guy to observe this. You have a lot of men of European descent passing these extraordinary laws.
It turns out of those practicing Christians who are over 2.5 times more likely to adopt people, they are disproportionately male. 73% of them are white, and of those they adopt, 63% are non-white. So this idea that they only care about white people, they only care about kids being born, they're not pro-life, they're just pro-birth. This is just not only a logical fallacy, but it's also objectively untrue. They're manipulating you by lying and slandering their neighbors. They have to lie about what abortion is. They have to lie about those who oppose it in order to manipulate you into supporting it. Now, let's go ahead and try to steel man the argument. I went at it hammer and tongs. Let's give it the most charitable spin. This normally comes out whenever it turns out the Republicans don't support every little leftist government policy that they hope will actually help people. Now, it may be. This is an argument about abortion. So I'm not going to try to argue against universal preschool, all right? But let me just point out that whenever, say, a Republican says, I don't think the Head Start program actually achieved what its intended outcome, and therefore we shouldn't fund it, it's not because that guy is only pro-birth. It's because he has a deep intellectual disagreement that may be right, may be wrong, about the efficacy of government policy. So in their private lives, they're not just pro-birth. When it comes to policy, they're not just pro-birth either, though they may disagree with leftist policy prescriptions. So what are we looking at here? They are twisting language to form what we call the slogan fallacy. Now, slogan isn't always fallacious, but it is. This comes from Peter Kreeft, who wrote a book called Socratic Logic. I really highly recommend you read it. It has a terrible cover, but it's got incredible content. He calls the slogan fallacy anytime somebody offers a proposition that is intended not to get you to think critically, but to get you to emotionally knee-jerk react against what's being said. That's what's intended when they say pro-birth. Let's go with a significantly easier objection to the pro-life movement. It's that you just want to control women's bodies. I assure you, I, along with every other major pro-life activist, couldn't care less. That's a huge pet peeve of mine. They couldn't care less about what you do with your body, even though they think a lot of things you're doing with your body are actually sin. I hate gauging ears. I dislike most tattoos. I believe that men and women should both dress modestly when in public, and I think that people who put arugula on pizza have actually endangered their souls. Yet, I don't want the government stepping in to stop any of these detestable culinary or otherwise practices. The only sense in which the pro-life movement wants to control women's bodies is that they want to stop them from killing children. Richard Posner actually summarized libertarianism as your rights end where my nose begins, right? The idea is you can swing around your hand anywhere you want. You can do whatever you want with your body. What you can't do is move your body in such a way that it harms other people. Next, they say you can't legislate morality, or I'm personally against abortion, but I wouldn't impose that on others. Everything we're discussing right now is moral philosophy, and whichever side gets their way is imposing their moral view on other people. They're legislating their morality. Let me prove that to you, because we don't normally think in these categories. I remember being probably 18, 20, whenever I heard somebody talk about this and being like, that's what you mean by morality? The pursuit of the good is just what we mean by morality. When you say, I want this public policy because I think it will be good, that's moral philosophy. So you're then imposing, legislating your morality. So if you think it's good for women to have the right to choose, rights are just another aspect of moral philosophy, then you are voting to legalize your morality. Really, the only laws that aren't explicitly moral are the most sort of innocent and uncontroversial ones. That how loud can you play your music in public? Or what time does the public pool close? Those things are not moral. Those are just sort of civil laws, but those aren't the ones that garner any serious attention. Again, this argument doesn't even attempt to address the question of, is the human being alive from the point of fertilization scientifically proven? And is it always wrong to kill people without moral justification, innocent people without moral justification? All right, a couple really silly ones here. Get your religion out of my womb. I hope you can see at this point in the video how silly this is. I've appealed, and the pro-life movement exclusively appeals to science, to ubiquitous moral laws, like it's wrong to kill innocent human beings, and then just the logic between those two. There's nothing sectarian about science, logic, rationality, moral axioms. Now, I do want to go ahead and plug the fact that I don't think there's a justification for moral worth, or rather I should say human worth, apart from humans being made in God's image. But if you're a humanist, a secular humanist, you obviously would disagree with that. And so you can still uphold that first premise, even if I don't think you have a good justification for it. Next, no uterus, no opinion. Even if you accept it, about half of women. Next, we have the no uterus, no opinion objection to the pro-life movement, which is silly on the face of it, but let's go ahead and let's accept it for a second. About half of women are pro-life. In some of the states with the strictest abortion laws, like Texas, women actually outvote the men. So in that sense, women are absolutely getting what they want in Texas. They're getting the pro-life movement that they're fighting for themselves. Second, we obviously shouldn't accept it. This is such a stupid epistemology, which is your theory of how you come to know what is true. This is the theory called standpoint epistemology. Let me go ahead and quote for you here. Standpoint epistemology is a feminist theoretical perspective that argues that knowledge stems from social position, meaning who you are and where you are in society determines what you can know. The perspective denies that traditional science is objective, and it suggests that research and theory have ignored and marginalized women and feminist ways of thinking. Now, just a brief little aside, because people don't understand how much Marxism has infiltrated and infested and buried itself into every different area of academia. I just want to point this out because it shows whenever you just start researching and reading the academic literature, you'll see references to Marxist theory literally everywhere. I know we're talking about abortion, but I just want to highlight here, this no uterus, no opinion is literally, I want to read here from an academic source. The theory emerged from the Marxist argument that people from an oppressed class have special access to knowledge that is not available to those from a privileged class. Now, why should we reject standpoint epistemology? The fact that it's Marxist is not an objection. Whenever I raise that, I'm not simply saying Marxist, boogeyman, get away from it. Rather, I'm simply pointing out its historic roots. And now, let's go ahead and tackle why we should reject it. First, it is false because women don't have a unified vision. Women are pretty much evenly divided on the pro-life, pro-choice debate, as I mentioned already. Second, this undermines science and rationality. In fact, it actually ultimately rejects the idea of objective reality. You can't even know objective reality. You can only know what your social position determines you to know. Finally, it's a nice example of what Alexander Proust has called the taxi cab fallacy. Premises cannot simply be adopted and dismissed as easily as an Uber. What I mean by that is, if you say no uterus, no opinion, you obviously don't want me to listen to pro-life women. So again, this is just a self-refuting nonsense. Now, let's try to steelman it if we can. Let's salvage it. Let's try to make it a little bit stronger. First off, men and women don't always have the same perspective. And that's really important. This is one of the fundamental divides in humanity. Our races, our ethnicities, our nationalities, these are far less determinative of our points of view and our ideas than our gender is. Your sex is essential to who you are and the way you have been created. And knowing that is important, and realizing that that will shape the way that you see things. And diversity of viewpoint does help you with the gaps in your knowledge. So hanging out with people who think a little bit differently than you will help you because you don't see everything perfectly. Even still, while I'm admitting that men and women think differently, and I'm insisting that we need to listen to alternative perspectives, that does not mean that we would ever blindly accept anybody's position, whether or not they're men or women. Rather, we use rationality, logic, science, evidence, everything we have at our disposal to try to weigh women just the same way we would men. Next, we get into what is a pretty hot button topic right now, which is that if we make it illegal, it will result in back alley abortions. First off, this is simply false. The idea that the statements you've heard that before Roe v. Wade there were 5,000 every year who died of back alley abortions, this was just made up. It came from a long, convoluted trail of citations from assumptions. In fact, there's a really good, and I'm shocked I'm going to say this, there's a really good Washington Post article on this. I'm going to quote from there. By 1959, a leading researcher wrote, "Abortion is no longer a dangerous procedure. This applies not just to the therapeutic abortions as performed in hospitals, but also to so-called illegal abortions as done by physicians." In 1957, there were only 260 deaths in the entire country attributed to abortions of any kind. In New York City, in 1921, there were only 144 abortion deaths. In 1951, there were only 51. There were only 15. The writer was Mary Calendrone, at the time medical director of Planned Parenthood. She attributed the decline in the mortality rate to antibiotics and the fact, get this, that 90% of illegal abortions were done by trained physicians. If, by God's grace, we are able to blot out this moral abomination, which has taken the lives of something like 60 million innocent humans in America, there will still be illegal abortions. And we can assume, as it was the case back in 1950, that the people who perform these quote-unquote back alley abortions will still be doctors who are flouting the laws and who are giving their patients access to the antibiotics that will keep them from dying en masse. Okay, the last one in this category of specifically anti-pro-life arguments is the if gun bans don't work, then neither will abortion bans. Now, this is not a claim to equate the morality of the two. If it were, I think some people do that, and that's moral lunacy. Possessing an arm to protect yourself against thieves, murderers, and tyrannical governments should not be anywhere near on moral grounding with somebody who is trying to intentionally kill their own child. But ignoring the morality of the two situations, what we actually find is that just isn't true. The abortion ban does work. Quoting now, this cohort study of 1,178 counties in 18 states evaluated the association between a highly restrictive state legislative climate and the abortion rate between 2000 and 2014. A highly restrictive policy climate, when compared with a less restrictive one, was associated with a significantly lower abortion rate by 0.48 abortions per 100,000, representing a 17% decrease in the median abortion rate of 2.89 per 1,000 women. And that's just a restrictive climate. That's not a full-blown abortion ban. Now, even if it takes a while for consistent enforcement to actually take place, we can assume that yes, abortion bans will in fact actually curtail abortions. Now we're getting into the last category, the actually pro-choice arguments. There are some subcategories. Here's our first category, the utilitarian arguments. First, they wouldn't have had a good life. It's okay to abort these children because look where they're being born into. These are unwanted kids born in terrible situations. So surely it's okay to abort them. And then we just have to ask, is it okay to kill an innocent human if it is possible that they may have a really hard life? Imagine social services taking away a 30-week-old girl from a drug addict mother with no close relatives and is put immediately into the foster care system. Now, imagine that you could sort of start calculating out the trauma that's going to happen to this girl throughout the rest of her life. Even still, none of us could imagine killing this little girl in her sleep That would be monstrous. Even if we could make sure that she didn't feel any pain, even if we could make sure that she wasn't scared at all, that would be abominable. And yet it would just be absolutely arbitrary in the extreme to simply say, well, it's wrong to kill the 30-week-old outside the womb, but it's not wrong to kill the person who's 30 weeks but still inside the womb. Every stage of development before that is simply an arbitrary point. And if I want to try to steelman this argument, I get the impulse, because the feeling, all right, or your moral intuition is that I'm preventing this human being from being real. I'm stopping this human being from existing, and therefore I'm preventing all the suffering they're going to go through. But your moral intuition has to change. We have to adjust our moral intuition when scientific facts contradict them. When we find out that beyond a shadow of a doubt that the human life begins at fertilization, and when we accept that human beings have inherent inalienable human rights, chief among them the right to life, like the right to not be killed, then what we have to say is to not want to snuff out the 30-week-old outside the womb is just as strong and certain of an intuition as I should feel about the baby that's inside the womb. And I want to really drive home, this is still based on a possibility. On the possibility this kid may have a terrible life, therefore he should be able to be snuffed out. She should be able to be starved to death or cut to pieces. That is insane. Now going to the Freakonomics argument that this will decrease crime. After Roe, there's a certain period of time and the decrease in crime happened among the age group that potentially was aborted. Here's the argument. It's the idea that the children who were aborted would have been born as unwanted children. The assumption there is that unwanted children are more likely to become criminals, and therefore stopping them from existence is stopping those crimes from happening in the future. Again, the moral intuition is if we simply prevent them from existing, then we're preventing those crimes. But we must, as moral people, we must grapple with reality as it actually is, not as we want it to be. And that the science says that it's alive. So while you don't realize it, you don't feel morally connected to a baby that's so small, it's not even protruding through the mother's stomach. It's still there. It's still real. Just because you don't see it doesn't mean it isn't in existence. And therefore, you have to change your intuitions and say, no. I'm not preventing somebody from existing and therefore preventing crime. I am killing somebody who exists and therefore preventing crime. And we're back to this possibility thing that I am now killing somebody who may do something bad. Further, if you adopt, which I don't and I don't think you should, but if you're pro-choice, there's a pretty high chance that you do. If you adopt the disparate impact theory of racism, meaning that if you can see a disparate impact between the way a policy affects black people and white people, then what you'll realize is that the people he's talking about is that primarily those who were aborted were, or not primarily, but disproportionately were black, and they were statistically more likely to commit crimes. Now, the author of Freakonomics insists that he isn't a racist and you shouldn't read him that way. And I actually don't think you should either, because I don't believe in the disparate impact theory of racism. But I will say, if you do adopt that, then this argument here should 100% keep you from it should keep you from endorsing this argument particularly. I believe it's Michael Knowles who said that he used to buy this specific argument, and a moral ethicist walked him through it. And they said, which of those arguments wouldn't apply to young black men, right? Because they are more likely to commit violent crimes, but you wouldn't be able to kill them. So if you can't kill a young black man because he's more likely to commit a crime, then you certainly couldn't justify aborting them. It's the same thing, scientifically speaking. Now let's go to the Ruth Bader Ginsburg argument. She says that if you have any rule against abortion, then this is by definition sexist. Why? Because if you impose restraints that impede her choice, you are disadvantaging her because of her sex. Now, let me see if I can sort of tease this out. I want to try to make the argument that she's raising or raised make sense, and then we'll go on to debunk it. So what she's saying is, this is because there would then therefore be laws that apply only to women, and these laws are restrictive in nature. So there's a choice that exists only for women, and now there's a law that exists exclusively to prohibit those women. Okay, I want to go ahead and throw in here, and this is not, I promise, this is not meant to be a gotcha. This is simply to help people think logically. If we include the trans ideology into the debate, the idea that men can become pregnant, if you start down that rabbit trail, then this argument becomes irrelevant. Now there is an equal application of the law because abortion would affect men just as much as it affects women. So in order to steelman her and give her give this argument the best chance it has, then I think we have to adopt the TERF position, which is a technical term for trans exclusionary radical feminists. A TERF is a feminist who excludes the rights of transgender women from their advocacy of women's rights. So basically, this is a full-blown feminist who just simply says that because a man dresses up in women's garb and feels like a woman and thinks of himself as a woman, that doesn't make him a woman, and therefore he shouldn't be involved in the feminist movement. Now, therefore, if that's the case, then this argument makes a little more sense because there are now laws, i.e. abortion, that would exclusively apply to women and not to men. Notice again, this argument does not in any way attempt to refute the idea that the babies are alive in the womb. It doesn't refute that it's wrong to kill innocent children. If anything, it maybe says it's okay to kill them because then it puts men and women on an equal playing field. That might be the most generous way to read this argument. And if that's the case, then that's the question that we have to ask. As a society, is it okay for women to be able to choose to kill their offspring if it simply levels the legal playing field? As Andrew Clavin puts it, you can murder your way out of a lot of situations, but it doesn't make murder correct or morally good. Now, the feminists may then retort, then the society should also ask, is it okay for laws to apply exclusively to women? Maybe that's inherently unjust. Maybe that's inherently inequitable. But I think we should keep in mind when wrestling with that sincere question that we already have those laws according to different categories. We have laws that apply explicitly to people based on their age, explicitly to people based on their marital status, to people based on how old they are. And I was thinking first in the young age. Now we also have laws that exclusively apply to people who are older. And we also have laws that apply to people's immigration status. If we think of equal protection under the law as saying that laws can only apply to everybody and that it's discriminatory for them to apply to one category, not to another, then I think we're going to find ourselves in a real messy situation. You can't have laws against driving at a certain age. You can't have laws against retirement being at a certain age. You can't have laws protecting really any class of people because then you're creating an inequity, laws applying to some and not to others. Rather, I think that we should think of equal protection under the law in the sense that no law shows unjust partiality. So in this exact instance, if we criminalize abortion, if we say, no, it's illegal and punishable, then let's say a man beats up his girlfriend to force her into a miscarriage. Then I think he should be guilty of, and I think in many cases he is even currently guilty of the highest extent of the law, including up to murder in many states. So while the man can't be guilty of, say, abortion, he could be guilty of, in that case, murder. So in that instance, given that scenario, we have the law the law isn't equally applied to both of them because they're different laws, but they don't show preference to either one. In either case, whether it be the mother who's getting an abortion or the man committing assault in order to cause abortion, in both instances, the law is attacking or is opposing both of those actions. All right, my next least favorite is the overpopulation argument. It's really good to deal with overpopulation. All right, even if we accept that overpopulation is going to be a problem, then what is it that we're actually afraid is going to happen? Well, we're afraid that human beings will become so populated that some human beings will starve to death. So we're afraid that some humans will simply die. Scientifically, abortion is killing a living human being. So here's what the argument would sound like. And again, some arguments are so bad, you just have to say them clearly in order to refute them. You don't have to then try to rebuff them. Some humans might die due to overpopulation. And that would be so horrible that we need to kill some humans now so that people might not die in the future. If we're going to go ahead and kill humans to stop overpopulation, then how about we just wait till we actually are dealing with overpopulation instead of maybe accidentally, preemptively purging a few million and then turning out that we actually didn't need to in the long run. And just a quick point of inconsistency, you know what's really good for culling the population and making sure that we don't overpopulate? Pandemics. But you didn't hear a whole lot from the overpopulation is threatening us all crowd during the pandemic. So moving on from the utilitarian arguments now to the bodily autonomy arguments. It's my body, it's my choice. Now this procedure removes cells that contain a totally different set of DNA than you. It removes a heart, yet your heart still is beating. It removes a brain, yet your brain is still functioning. It removes 10 fingers, though you still have 10 fingers. It removes 10 toes, though you still have 10 toes. And it removes a spine, even though you still have a spine. It's obviously not a procedure that is affecting your body. There's also a self-refutation here. Imagine a woman is visibly pregnant and say 6 months pregnant. I mean, she's really showing at this point. And she was outside of a club at 3 o'clock in the morning. She's just schmammered, just sloppy drunk. All right. And she is just chain smoking. And you look at her and you feel like this disgust, right? Because look what she's doing to her child. While you are probably okay with her getting sloppy drunk, staying out super late, being promiscuous, chain smoking and destroying her own lungs, you're not okay with her doing it to the baby in the womb. In fact, 43 states actually outlaw drinking heavily while pregnant. And yet, what is way worse for a child? To be born with fetal alcohol syndrome or to not be born chopped up and sucked into a sink? All right, moving on. It's dependent on the mother. Because it's dependent on the mother, therefore, it must not be murder. Now, this is the kind of thing that you think of whenever you haven't had a child. The child outside the womb is every single bit as dependent on the mother as the child inside the womb. Here's the only difference. The baby in the womb comes with its own snack pouch, its own oxygen supply, and in a convenient carry case. The baby outside the womb requires all the same work, all the same nutrients, except for you have to then intentionally give it to the baby. It doesn't happen on automatic withdrawal. I hear this one a lot on internet debates, though not so much in person. People will say like, well, you can't force me to give an organ to somebody, even if it was my fault. Say I got in a car accident and it ruptured somebody's spleen or maybe their kidney. You can't force me to give up one of my kidneys for them. Now, this assumes that the baby in the womb is a random person to whom you have no moral obligation, but we already, in our laws and in our long-standing American tradition and Anglo-American tradition, and I'm willing to bet, though I'm not an anthropologist, in most societies throughout human history, we believe that women and men have more moral obligation to their own progeny than they do to random strangers. So we already hold women to certain moral obligations when it comes to their kids, including giving them their organs. Now I don't mean literally dispossessing their bodies and putting them into their own children. Rather, you have to touch your baby. Your baby needs skin-to-skin time, and your skin is an organ. It needs your eye contact. It needs your vocal cords. It needs your words, your words of affirmation. It needs your kisses. It needs your snuggles. Babies need the milk from a mother's breast. We require for mothers to either, and fathers too, to either provide all of this to their children or ensure somebody else does. All right. So we already hold parents to this standard. So that this idea that we can hold them to the standard after birth but not before birth is just scientifically untenable. There's no difference in what that baby is. The location has no difference. It is a living human being in the womb. It does belong to that woman and to the father, and therefore they must, before and after birth, care for that child. There's no problem with that. Next, consent to sex is not consent to pregnancy. Yowza. Okay, my favorite response to this one is saying that that's like saying consent to eating food is not consent to pooping, right? Of course it is. In fact, let's get really scientific. Let's get real biological here. Okay, coitus, copulation, sex. These are all terms for what? What is this? When you study this, let's get religion all the way out of it. Let's go hyper-Darwinist here. What is sex? In the most base and biological sense, it is the reproductive act between two human beings. So yes, There's a chance of reproduction when you engage in the reproductive act. And anytime you engage in an activity knowing its risks, you are consenting to the possibility of those risks. Wrapping up here, just a few more. Next, you got the viability. You're against abortion after viability. I've heard this from family. I've heard this from friends. I've heard this from people online. This was the standard that Roe v. Wade established. Now, here's the problem. That viability is not primarily an attribute of humanity. It's an attribute of scientific advancement. A child is viable at, say, 21 to 24 weeks if he lives very close, if at the moment, not even lives, if he is at the moment very close to a highly technologically advanced hospital. That very same kid in the mother's womb then is transported to a very remote location deep in the Appalachian Mountains or somewhere else that's utterly extravagant and totally off the grid. That kid is no longer viable. Why? Because the resources that are required to make that person survive outside the womb or to aid them to survive outside the womb is too far away. Your human rights are not dependent on your location. They are inalienable. They are inherent. They belong to you because you're a human, not because of your location, not because of your social status, not because of the technological advance, not because of where you are chronologically. People at the same stage of development were not viable in that same location, but 100 years ago. Time, location do not give us our worth. Neither does technology. And again, if you were to adopt the disparate impact theory of racism, then what this would mean, because this would disproportionately affect Black communities and Black countries in particular, this argument would be a racist argument. Again, I think that's silly, but that's your standard if it is your standard. So maybe just ditch that standard. What about the hardest emotional case is in the case of rape, okay? This is an emotionally devastating argument to talk about. All right, because you're talking about people's lives who have been utterly destroyed. In the Bible, now I'm not getting religious here about abortion, but in the Bible, it says that if a man rapes a woman, he should be put to death because raping a woman is just as damaging as murder. So now we're talking about what this person, the moral dilemma that this person now faces after they have been, in one sense, the victim of something as heinous as murder. While it's emotionally very difficult, logically, it's not very difficult at all. But whenever you go about it purely logically, you come across robotic and unhuman and unfeeling. So I just want to say this before we go any further. If you are a woman who is in this situation, I want to do nothing but help you. Nobody here wants to do anything but help you. And if you reach out to my YouTube channel on any of my social medias, I will get you in contact with people who will provide you with every single resource you need right now, from psychological help to financial help to anything else that you need to adoption services. We want to take care of you and this child. We don't want to cause any more suffering. That said, we do have to deal with this as it is brought up in the context of trying to justify abortion. Let's say that you're like the George Bush kind of a guy, and you say, yeah, okay, in the case of rape, it's justified. Even if you accept that, because this only affects the largest number I've been able to hear anybody quote, though I haven't been able to verify, is 2%. The numbers I've seen are as low as 0.2%, so 0.2%, and 0.5%. Now, because this affects such a vanishing minority of people who seek abortion, then what this is a cynical ploy to try to use a hard case to justify the vast, vast, vast majority. Now, if I were to say right now, okay, let's make, in the case of rape, legal, in every other case illegal, the person who brought it up almost never actually would never take that bargain, right? Because they're not actually trying to justify abortion only in the case of rape. They're trying to justify all abortions because of the rape case. This is cynicism. This is evil. It's wicked. It's using people's suffering to try to obfuscate and cloud an otherwise clear conversation. So what should we do in the case of rape? I think to add in one more, universal moral axiom. Children should not be punished, especially at the highest extent, meaning capital punishment. Children should not be punished for the sins of their fathers. We shouldn't kill kids because their fathers deserve death. Now, if you want to have a very serious conversation about actually putting rapists and pedophiles not just behind bars for a few extra months, but putting them behind bars literally forever, chemically castrating them, executing them, I'm more than happy to have that conversation. It's the left side of the aisle that tends to be very, very soft on crime in general and also against sexual crimes, including our most recent addition to the Supreme Court. All right, last two. Here's the major one. I love this one because it's so insidious and so many people think that it's actually good. It's the personhood argument, and it's forwarded by Steven Pinker. Listening to intellectuals talk about this viewpoint of his, as though it's like, that seems a little passé, is so detestable. It's really it's difficult to understand how they can live with themselves. Here's what he argues. Human life does not have value simply because it is human life. Rather, human life has value because it contains, and here's the quote here, certain morally significant traits that we as humans happen to possess. Okay, now what are those traits? Let me go ahead and quote here. One such trait is having a unique sequence of experiences that defines us as an individual and connects us to other people. Other traits include an ability to reflect on ourselves as a continuous locus of consciousness, to form and to savor plans for the future, to dread death, and to express the choice not to die. But here's the rub, he says, that our neonates don't possess these traits any more than a simple mouse does. Therefore, he's saying abortion and even neonatal infanticide, the killing of really, really, really little babies, should not be put on the same level of morally unconscionable behavior as actual murder does. You have to understand, this is a full-on assault of the first premise. He is saying that it is not always wrong to kill innocent humans. If that is not a reductio ad absurdum, before we even try to attack it, again, just to say it clearly, he's saying it is not always wrong to kill innocent humans. You have to be able to look at something like that and say, it doesn't matter how many impressive words you put next to it. It doesn't matter how much philosophy you attach to it. I'm a huge fan of philosophy. I'm a huge fan of huge words. At a certain point, you have talked yourself into evil, and you need to grapple with that. He is saying that because they don't think of themselves, because they can't savor life, and they don't know the difference between white wine with fish and red wine with a steak, because they can't refuse death as best they can, then they don't deserve life. Now, not only is that unconscionable, not only is it pure evil, but it flies in the face of the American founding philosophy, which is that all men are imbued by their Creator, endowed by their Creator, with inalienable rights. These belong to you. You don't grow into them. You don't just happen to possess them, but because you're a human by yourself, that makes you worthy of not being killed, especially when you're innocent. Just to put a super fine point on it, whenever you make those certain traits the linchpin for moral value, then you have immediately called into question not just the rights of, say, infants, but even the rights of toddlers, certainly the rights of people who have mental disabilities and people who have suffered severe car accidents. I think you also put in danger people who are temporarily not possessing those, right? So somebody who is asleep no longer is aware of all these things, right? So for 8 hours a day, you don't possess your rights. Well, of course they would say that that's silliness, but why? If the possession of those traits is what gives you your value, then at any moment you don't possess those traits, you no longer have that value. Now you may say, at best they're setting them down, but they're going to pick them back up at 8 a.m. when their alarm goes off. That's when those traits will come back. So in the in-between, okay, it's not that big of a deal. If you're saying that there's a predictable amount of time between when that person loses those traits and will gain them, that because that amount of time is predictable, therefore we should count them as having them continuously, then we can make the exact same argument for the infant. Because the 40-week-old baby in the womb, because the 24-week-old baby in the womb, because the zygote in the womb will predictably possess every one of those traits within a certain period of time if left to its own devices. If not intentionally killed, then obviously it should possess every one of those rights the same way that the sleeping man does, because he will pick them up in 8 hours or so. All right, we're down to our last one. This one is supposed to be the gotcha question, and I got to be honest, it is so unbelievably weak and unsophisticated. I can't wait to tackle it. It's the IVF clinic. So here's the hypothetical. Imagine you find yourself in a burning IVF clinic, and there's a toddler here, and there's a box next to the toddler, and it says 5,000 embryos. Now, you say that you think that they're alive, that those are living human beings, and yet I know that you're going to take the kid. You're going to go for the kid, and all of us feel that same moral intuition. I'm going to take the kid instead of the 5,000 embryos, and therefore this is supposed to prove that at the deepest level, you actually don't believe the embryos possess human rights like the right to life. Of course, this is silly, but why? You have a hard time putting your finger on it. Let me see if I can do it. First off, the fundamental problem with the IVF clinic is that with this specific, when you set it up as this person's going to die, or this person's going to die, or this group of people is going to die, you are now no longer talking about whether or not they have the right to life. In fact, it's almost assumed that there's some tension here in your decision-making process, and that would imply that there's some sort of right to life in both cases. This is just a warmed over version of the trolley car problem. 10 people on this track, one person on that track. You can't get either one of them out of the way. You can't move the one, you can't move the 10. So you have to decide, is the train going to go towards the 10 and kill them, or we pull the switch and kill the one and save the 10? Now, in that scenario, both the 10 and the 1 have the right to life. And yet we're choosing to save the 10 because of for other reasons, other than simply their base rights. So now when we go to this situation where we have the toddler and the box of embryos, while it seems to be suggesting like, oh, well, you think that they don't really have, if you thought they had the right to life, those embryos had the right to life, then you would go for them because surely 5,000 outweighs the 1, and therefore you're being inconsistent, or maybe you're not inconsistent, maybe you're just simply revealing that deep down you don't actually believe it. But rather, your moral intuitions, while first off, people will point out that your intuitions are not always perfect. Second, more fundamentally than that, you may be doing a base level, sort of gut level calculus that you're not quite aware of. Let's see if we can actually complicate this scenario just a little bit. What if instead of a toddler, it was a terminally ill man who was also a heinous criminal? Say a war criminal. Let's say he was a 90-year-old Nazi with stage 55 cancer. Okay, I mean he's way past stage 4. This guy's minutes away from death, and now you got a box of 55 or 5,000 embryos. Okay, I mean it's an easy choice. You go for the embryos. What's going on there? Why? Because that man has a right to life. Well, maybe he forewent his right to life because of his evil deeds. All right, let's say he just has the cancer. He's not a Nazi. Just a super, super old guy. He's got minutes to live. 5,000 embryos. You're going to go with embryos. Why? Not because he doesn't have the right to life, but because you know that by picking him, he has so little time left that it feels almost like a waste of the effort. Whereas if I pick the embryos, then even if only a few of them actually get implanted and get to flourish in life, that's at least something, right? Well, what's going on here when you pair it up with the toddler? It's this gut level that here you have a human that's already flourishing, and there you have a box of humans that are almost certainly not going to be adopted. They will almost certainly be frozen for time immemorial, maybe destroyed. They will, even if, because IVF is inherently very, very risky, if you take all those 5,000 and you actually somehow get them to be implanted in women, they likely will not themselves actually embed themselves in the uterine wall. This sort of gut level calculation goes into it. And so they're simply trying to confuse you into thinking that you don't value the embryos. Let's see if we can turn it into something that's significantly more realistic. All right, so now it's not a life for a life, where you're assuming both of them have the right to life, and now you're trying to weigh out other qualifications or other moral attributes. Instead of it being a toddler now, let's say it's a 20-year-old woman. And instead of a box of 5,000 embryos, let's say it's 1. Now, let's say if she is allowed to stomp on that embryo, then she can go to college this year. Normal full-time college. She gets to join a sorority, make some connections there, have a nice life. If she doesn't stomp on the embryo, then she has to go to night school because she'll have to inevitably take care of the kid. Now, hopefully your moral intuitions feel a little more conflicted now. Why is that? Because now what you're dealing with is one person's right to life versus another person's privilege of going to college or joining a sorority or starting their career, right? Now you're comparing rights to privileges, which is the actual debate about abortion. The debate about abortion is not over the life of the mother. We already covered that earlier in the video, an hour and something ago. That if it actually came down to just the mother, the life of the mother and the life of the baby, that'd be fine. Okay, then that may actually justify the abortion. That isn't really the crux of the debate. The crux of the debate is the 99.9% of women who get completely elective abortions. So it's them balancing out their privileges versus the right of their living children to survive. If that doesn't shift your moral intuitions, then let me simply suggest that I think there may be something deeply wrong about your moral intuitions, and you should spend some more time trying to cultivate your intuitions towards what is good and right and true and beautiful. My name is Ryan Martin. This is Unsafe Media. If you like this type of in-depth, thorough, careful analysis of the ideas that shape our time, like, share, subscribe, hit the bell. And if you want to support this kind of content, you can support ongoing on Patreon or one time on Venmo. If you think I missed any arguments that should have been brought up or refuted, please put them down in the comments. And if you think that I missed a really integral part of one of these arguments, maybe I blew it, and you think that actually the IVF clinic is better than I think it is, please put your thoughts down below and I'll see if I can't respond to it. For now, I'm Ryan Martin. Be blessed.